Okay, great.
All right, and then we move on to the last talk for today. We're very happy to have SueYeon Chung here. SueYeon did her bachelor at Cornell in physics and mathematics, her PhD in applied physics from Harvard, and then moved on to postdoctoral positions at Harvard and Columbia. After that, she moved on to the Center for Computational Neuroscience at the Flatiron Institute. And now she's coming here to Harvard as an assistant professor. As you can see, she has a very diverse background. So she also gave a lecture at the summer school last week, and it was very good. So you're in for a treat. And I challenge you, with her background, to find a question she cannot answer. I didn't manage to, so please go ahead.
Thank you for the introduction. So I was here last week for, I guess, in the engineering building for the summer school. Just wanted to get a little sense of how many of you were also at the summer school here? Okay, so maybe about half of you. And then the other are like local, I guess, or like from elsewhere. Okay, good to know. So for those of you who were at the summer school, there's probably going to be a little bit of overlap with the latter part of the talk I gave, but there's also a good chance to ask in-depth questions, and because the talk was a little bit theory heavy. So yeah, I just wanted to give a little heads up. So okay, so thanks for the invitation to talk here, and my research is on computational neuroscience, and also at the intersection between computational neuroscience and deep learning, and I use methods from statistical physics and machine learning to do that, so before doing that, it might be actually worth talking about what it means to study computation in the brain. And that goes to the question of what is a neural computation, and that may have different types of answers depending on what your background is. And it could be like a functional map if you're a mathematician, or dynamical system, or Turing machine if you're a computer scientist. But the version of the definition of neural computation that is probably most satisfying to me as a theorist that's interfacing with experimental science is by thinking about it as a transformation of a sequence of transformations of neural representations, so that by the end of the information processing, these representations become more amenable to perform tasks or computations at hand. So then you might ask a following question on what is a neural representation, and that brings us to this picture of multiple levels of abstraction if you're coming from cognitive science, or multiple sizes or scales if you're coming from physics, where we have behavior and task functions in the highest level and a macroscopic level, and individual neurons where the cells are firing individually, and single neurons are potentiating next to each other to either strengthen or weaken the synaptic connections between them at the lowest level or microscopic level. And in systems neuroscience, a central question in understanding what happens in the brain at the computational and functional level is to really to describe how a collection of these neurons and a collection of these individual synapses collectively implement behavior and tasks. And importantly, the structure of these collective activities of neurons, they manifest themselves as what is known as neural representation, which is a key conceptual notion both in neuroscience, but nowadays also in deep learning, which is also sometimes called representation learning. So these representations are, in my view, a crucial intermediate level descriptor that goes between what's going on at the task and computation level, and also what's going on at the single neuron and single unit, individual units level. And to study this, we're using three related approaches to understand how these representations give rise to tasks or functions in the brain. And the first approach is to use theories for connecting the geometrical structure in neural population activities, which is sometimes also called neural manifolds, and connecting that to the amount of information that is embedded in the representations. And second approach that we're using is to use these geometrical insights that comes from theory to reason about how neural populations encode information, and also use it as a data analysis framework that can be used to characterize population-level neural recordings and also the features that are extracted from internal representations of deep networks. And finally, we can combine the insights that come from neuroscience and deep learning and also combine it with techniques from machine learning to build artificial neural networks, both as a model of the brain, but also for achieving robust performances. Let me start with the first and the second part, which is focused more on neural manifolds, which refers to the geometrical structure of neural population activities and applying that to understand the data. But it's worth first talking about what are some classical approaches that were already out there to talk about the population level representations and the amount of information that is embedded in those populations. So if you are thinking about these neural populations that are implementing very simple problem, like solving a simple discrimination task, such as like something that's moving to the left or right in like a very small increment, or some orientation has changed clockwise or counterclockwise, and so this is known as a fine discrimination problem between two variables that are nearby. And then that is also, it turns out that is explicitly relatable to an estimation problem of some continuous variable. And the approaches that were developed historically to study this are usually the ones that rely on information theory or signal detection theory. And then the story goes you can use something like efficient information because that bounds the variance of the given estimator. So it gives you some estimate of how well you can do on estimation as a function of the population. And you can also choose some decoder of your choice. And you can take the population activities and project those to the decoder of choice, and then on that you'll see that a bunch of points that are projected that should correspond to like positive delta versus those others that are supposed to correspond to negative delta. They will form two separate clouds or two separate distributions. And calculating things like a signal to a noise ratio on those clouds should capture the overall picture of the separability, which is related to the computation that you're trying to do, such as fine discrimination problem. So those work actually pretty well as long as your problem is very simple and there's not too many like surprising structures in your data. But in real life, a lot of the tasks that we face in a naturalistic setting are pretty complex. So if you consider computations or behavioral tasks like watching a video or navigating in a real environment where what's being varied in a sequence of images in a naturalistic video is not just one simple variable, like a position of something, but there's many different things that are changing in the sequence of images. Or if you're, living in a world where you're trying to reach for different things by doing some sort of motor tasks, Again, even if there may be like a target, there's many different variables that may be changing, despite the fact that you have a simple task of reaching for a target. And the list goes on. You may be navigating in a real physical environment, and you may be in a department store where you're trying to like go somewhere, but it's not. What matters, what is in the environment is not just simply your position, but also many other things that are changing, such as like other people. So a common thread in the description of all of these tasks is that there are many different variables that are at play to capture the stimuli that are existing that are being implemented in the computation that I just described. In other words, these naturalistic stimuli, they present a lot of different multidimensional nuisance variations that end up introducing complex shapes of variabilities that the task needs to be invariant to. So what do we do when you have these complex shapes of variabilities that are being embedded by the neural population? And this was actually a pretty big and a challenging problem because a lot of the times when an animal is navigating in a real environment, and when you have neural recordings that are corresponding to underlying those behavior, it was kind of unclear what to do. And this is when the idea of what's known as representation geometry or neural manifolds becomes useful, because it gives us an intuition and a visual picture of how neural population activities, which are typically in high dimension, are organized, so because you can visualize those in low dimensional space. And indeed, when you look at the literature, there's a lot of interesting geometrical structures that have been observed in these kinds of neural population activity data underlying all sorts of different tasks. So these are some of the examples. This is like looking at the trajectory in the neural representation while the task for a machine or an animal is to look at some naturalistic video coming in a sequence. Or this is another example where a monkey is trying to reach for a different task, and the task can be parameterized as multiple dimensional variables. And then if you look at the neural recordings, it tends to have some similar topology as a task structure, while the actual shape may be varied depending on how neural activities are actually responding. And this is also a recording from prefrontal cortex when a monkey is solving some Bayesian prior implementing problem. And then this is another example which is visualizing neural activities while an animal is navigating in a 2D real space. So a lot of these examples can be found in this review paper that I just wrote a couple years ago on what's known as now neural population geometry as an approach for understanding both biological and artificial neural networks. But the bottom line here is that it's evident that geometry is very useful for thinking about these sorts of questions. But the remaining question that was not really addressed by these simple visualization picture is that how do we relate that to the actual computation that's being implemented by these representations? And we can be systematic about it by considering this following picture. So let's say we're given an image, like you give a stimulus, and let's say you have some electric probes that are implanted in some visual cortex, and there will be many neurons that will be responding, and that can be turned into a vector in high-dimensional neural state space where each element of this vector would correspond to the number of spikes for a particular neuron. For example, if you're recording from 100 neurons, this would be a vector in a 100-dimensional space. But in real life, with all these variabilities that I talked about and that we need to be invariant to, So for example, we can recognize a dog, but the dog can be moving around or going towards you or away from you. And with all of these variations, neurons will also respond a little bit differently, and these response vector in the neural state space will also move around in the high dimensional space. And that will, this moving around of the neural response vector will have some sort of underlying geometry. And we ended up somehow, so this kind of structure was found everywhere in neural data, and I think people really needed to call it something. And collectively, sort of sociologically, people have in the field have started calling it neural manifolds, despite the fact that oftentimes these are not really like mathematically rigorous, like manifold in a mathematically rigorous sense. And often these are just geometrical structures. But what you can guess from how this term has emerged is that there's an assumption that there's some sort of underlying manifold, despite the fact that the real recordings are often looking more like point clouds with some underlying structure that is low dimensional. And an important hypothesis that's gaining a momentum in the field is that if we can really understand the structure of these neural manifolds and connect it to the functional role or some computational role, then we can learn something about how the brain is implementing a computation in a distributed manner. But I still haven't told you about how we can relate this to some computational or coding property, and we can really make it tractable in what's known as an invariant object recognition problem, which refers to our ability to recognize and discriminate different objects, despite the fact that there's all sorts of variabilities that are constantly existent in real life. So for example, we can recognize that the pictures on the top as a car versus all these other pictures that are not cars, despite the sizes and orientations and backgrounds of that are in these images. Now, when you're trying to distinguish between two separate objects, for example, dogs from cats, then from the perspective of formalizing, what that means is that we can represent the task of discriminating dogs from cats or recognizing dogs away from cats as a problem of separating these object neural manifolds in the neural activity space with the sheet or hyperplane that is placed in between them. And this is known as a linear readout or perceptron, where the direction that is normal to this hyperplane, it corresponds to the weights for the linear readout that's reading off from the populations in the neural activities or representations in deep networks. And so now the remaining question is if we can connect this representation or object manifolds, a geometrical structure, to some downstream decoding performance. And the complication here is that unlike having some simplistic noise like added Gaussian or Poisson, when you have these variations that are caused by some stimuli space that we consider to be nuisance, and they have all gone through some sort of transformations through different processing stages, then you often end up with these really complex shapes where if you project those to the downstream decoding space, they're often not like a simple unimodal distributions where you can just capture it with mean and variance, and often you might end up with this complicated shapes. So what do you do when you're trying to capture and characterize this structure and relate to the downstream decoder, where you can't simply use the first one or two moments of the statistics? And then so this was the point where there were many papers that were being written in our field about relating the structure in neural populations and then relating it to the discriminability, and people were using, again, things like the older methods like visual information and signal detection theory, and then they try to connect it to different types of measures of correlations, but that is still the low moments. So what do we do to capture these complex shapes? And it actually turns out that it may be actually better to capture the complex shapes of these neural manifolds back in full n-dimensional space, and then try to really characterize the geometry of the whole thing in the ground truth or raw data space, instead of going to the projected decoding space, and somehow try to relate it to the decoder's performance. And it actually turns out that there's still a theory that we can turn to other than the signal detection theory. And then that is the well-developed theory of linear separability called the theory of perceptrons. And so this goes, again, back to the older theory in computer science known as Cover's theorem, which gives you a formula for the critical number of points that you can linearly classify per dimension when you assign random binary labels to all of the points that are given to you. So for example, if you are, so let's say you have p points, so p points that are given to you, and so that means that you can assign the binary labels in 2 to the p different ways, and you can ask the question on out of those 2 to the p different ways, how many of those random label assignments are linearly separable. And when you are in this regime where you have a small number of points while you're in high dimensional space, then it's very easy to solve this problem. And when you look at the probability of being able to find a linear separable solution for all of your dichotomies, the dichotomy means assignment of random labels, most of the time you'll find that it is linearly separable, so you'll be in this space. But as you add more and more points to your given space in the data, the problem will get harder and harder. And at some point, there will be too many points in the dimension that you're given. And when you ask the question of, okay, like out of 2 to the p points, 2 to the p dichotomies, what is the fraction of being able to find a solution? You'll find that you'll be here, where most of the time you won't be able to find a solution. So that defines this phase transition of going from being mostly separable to being mostly inseparable, and the shape of the transition is also dependent on the dimension of your data. So the bigger your data is, or the bigger the ambient dimension of your data, the steeper this transition is going to be. And the capacity for linearly classifying the points or patterns are defined as the maximum number of points per dimension, which is p over n here, which is what's changing on the x-axis, such that almost all possible dichotomies of random label assignments are linearly separable, which is defined as the point where this curve crosses about 50%. And Cover's theorem basically provides an analytical formula for this probability that a random classification of p points in n dimension can be implemented by a linear readout or a perceptron. So this is a classical theory of linear separability, but it still doesn't take an important aspect of linear classification, which is robustness to noise. And a similar work by Elizabeth Gardner in late 80s and has used the methods from statistical physics to calculate what's known as perceptron capacity for a given imposed margin, which is a measure of robustness to noise. And that corresponds to if you have these points that are positive and then these points that are negative, margin is defined as a distance between the worst points from the perspective of a classifier to the classifier. So what that means is that the bigger the margin is, the more robust this hyperplane is to the noise. So the earlier work on Cover's theorem was only assuming that the points need to be in general position, and there wasn't much descriptions about the statistics of the points, but this new physics style work assumed various different statistical assumptions that the points need to be in Gaussian distribution with some variance, and that allowed for the introduction of the magnitude of the margin that you can impose on the problem. And now, with her theory, it became possible to calculate the number of the points you can linearly classify as a function of an imposed margin. And you can see that the larger the imposed margin, the smaller the capacity is, because it's a harder problem. Like imposing a larger margin is a harder problem. So this is a very nice theory, and then this has actually kind of opened the new subfield of statistical physics of neural networks in 90s, and a lot of subsequent works have followed along. But there still was a big challenge, which is that a lot of work in this domain have had this kind of simplifying assumptions that I just talked about, such as Gaussian, binary random, and things like that. But real data in high-dimensional space has complex shapes, and making these theories that are relevant for dealing with real data was still a big challenge. And also, these theories were most of the time about these discrete points, and then as soon as you have a smoothly varying object that you can recognize in an invariant manner, something like a video stream, there will be infinitely many points, and this classical theories quickly becomes irrelevant, because what's the point of having an estimate for how many points you can classify, where even like a small picture of a dog that has moved a little bit has infinitely many points. So to account for this complex structure of data due to variability, we ended up developing a new step-back theory of classification of manifolds, where the counting unit for the perceptron capacity is each manifold rather than each point. So the definition of the capacity is actually quite similar to what I described with the points, except that now we're talking about P manifolds, where you assign binary labels to these P manifolds, and on each manifold you're not allowed to have different labels, but between the manifolds you're allowed to have different labels. And we have a series of works on this, but and that goes from classifying lines of like some length to some spheres with radius and dimension with some parameterizable geometry, to point clouds with some general shapes, where then the problem becomes classification of convex halls of those points. So it turns out that you can actually calculate the capacity for classifying manifolds, and you can. This is some example of how you can set up the problem where each point on the manifold can be described as a center plus some basis vectors in n-dimensional space, where in front of the basis vectors you have a shape parameter. And if you're solving this problem as a parameterization problem, like line or sphere, you can impose some functional shape. While if you have set of points, then you just have a bag of these S's on which you do some iteration problem. And to solve this problem, you have to set it up as the problem of calculating the volume of solutions, where, for example, if you're trying to classify these points, and what you want to do is to write down the distance between the worst point on the manifold from the perspective of the imposed from the perspective of the weight, and then you want that minus margin to be an input to the step function, and then this is defined for each manifold, and then you do a product over all of these manifolds, which means that you know only when all of your manifolds are classified correctly you'll have 1, but otherwise you'll have 0, and you do an integration over the whole weight space in n-dimensional space. And the capacity happens when these volume of valued weight vectors shrinks to 0, because when the problem is easy, you'll have large space of solutions, and when you're beyond capacity, you won't have any solutions, so you want to basically set this to go to 0, and to calculate this, what you need to do is this H needs to be either written in terms of the functional form of this manifold, or you need to do an iterative process to find the worst point in a given set of points. And the Z is actually kind of hard to compute. If you're trying to get an average of the Z, that's hard to compute because there's a product of many random contributions. So what you need to do is to turn it into a log of Z and compute the average of this log. And to do that, we introduce this method from spin glass theory called replica trick. And from here on, it is mostly just analytic calculations for several pages to turn these functions into exponential forms and changing the variables and calculating free energy and et cetera, so on. And with that, what you get is an expression where you can get an explicit expression of the manifold capacity for linearly classifying these manifolds as a function of the geometry. And that can be interpreted as either or both how many neural manifolds or categories can you pack into the neural activity space so that you can linearly separate those. Or you can also think of it as a per neuron or per dimensional information content about object classes. And what this theory gives you is the following, where you can distinguish between two different data clouds or scenarios where the data may be untangled and well separated, and that should correspond to high manifold capacity. While if you have tangled and kind of diffused manifold, that will correspond to low manifold capacity. And those are determined by or influenced by the geometry of these manifolds. That is, if these neural manifolds are low dimensional and small, meaning small radius, that would correspond to higher manifold capacity. And then while if you're thinking about the correlations between the centers of the manifolds versus the organization or axis correlation between manifold, you want these manifolds to be spread out, hence a lower correlation between the centers, and you want the axes of these manifolds to be aligned such that they're stacked, and then that will correspond, and so you would want the higher correlation between the axes, and then that will correspond to the higher manifold capacity. And another thing that's also notable is that these geometrical measures don't always go together. So it can always go in a direction where after some kind of transformation process, you may end up with lower dimensionality and higher radius, and vice versa. But the key here is that the manifold capacity can be expressed as a function of these geometrical measures. So the earlier versions of these papers are already out, then we went through a series of relaxations of assumptions, but the latest paper that we put out on the bioRxiv recently is the version that includes all of these geometrical measures, and then it has the best fit to the empirical capacity. And this has a lot of implications when it comes to dealing with the data, but the most exciting part is that unlike the 2D or 3D embedding of the high-dimensional data, where you have to make a decision on which axis you're going to keep versus which axis you're going to throw away, here we're talking about having an equation where on the left-hand side or on one side of the equation you have this linear classification capacity, which is a decoder's capacity, and on the other side of the equation you have function of geometries. And then that geometry means that you're measuring the geometry in full n-dimensional space. So you don't really need to throw away most of your data in order to get the visualization, but you can simply get a statistical measure of the structure in the data. Another aspect that's interesting is the fact that because we have these geometrical measures, it seems to give us some language to describe high-dimensional data and come up with some hypotheses. And it also allows us to connect the geometry of the representations to lower-level properties like selectivity profiles of neurons, which really brings us closer to the systems neuroscientist's goal of the neuronal basis of cognition or behavior. And then we can briefly talk about how this method can be applied. So for example, this was one of the first use cases by taking the AlexNet, which is a deep network, and then we take these images from ImageNet with many different categories, and you run these, and then you can extract these from the layers, and then you can also generate the manifolds in different ways, such as taking an image and you can move it around left and right, and then make this smoothly varied manifold. And it turns out that what you find is that the manifold capacity improves across the layers of a deep network, which means that they are becoming better separated. And not only is it getting separated, but also we understand from the theory that the dimensionality of the manifolds are getting smaller, and they're getting flatter in terms of their shapes. And the radius of the manifold is also getting smaller, which means that they're becoming more compressed for each categories, while the correlation between the manifolds are getting smaller, which means that the locations of these manifolds are getting spread out. Another additional interpretation of the capacity is that it's not just about the linear separability, but also about the efficiency of representing these object manifolds, because the manifold capacity means how many category manifolds you can linearly classify per dimension. So there's an improved efficiency in terms of representing categories. And you can also apply this on real biological recordings in monkeys, and we find a pretty similar trend in the visual cortex of the monkeys that the capacity improves, and the dimensionality, radius, and center correlations get smaller, and the axis correlations are acting a little bit funny, which we're trying to understand right now. And we have been applying this on a lot of different deep network models as an interpretability tool, including the latest work on interpreting the representations of large language models and what happens when you have different kind of prompting strategies, as well as understanding generalization or learning dynamics. We can apply this on a lot of different neural recordings to understand what's going on in real biological brains underlying all sorts of animals doing different tasks. And this is another example where you can go down from geometry to even lower level, and this is a classical, just retackling a classical neuroscience problem, where the focus of this work was to understand why the neurons and cells that we see in the real brain are so diverse and heterogeneous, meaning that, so like you can, there's all sorts of different cell types and different selectivity profiles that are found in the brain, and this is a very ubiquitous problem. And there's this question on what is the role of this heterogeneity in neuronal response profiles in emergent information coding. And to do this, what we did is to make neurons with what's known as tuning curves. This is the selectivity profiles of neuronal cells with different parameters, and we made neural manifolds for responses that are corresponding to different stimuli sets. And we made one population of neurons with a big variance in the amplitude of neuronal selectivity profile versus another set of neural population where there's a variance in the width of the selectivity profiles of the neurons, and compared it with another population where all of the neurons were responding in a completely homogeneous way. And what we find is that when you have the neuronal selective profiles with amplitude diversity, then the neural manifolds corresponding different stimuli, they end up being pushed away from each other, so their distances get farther away, and that results in more efficient and more separable representations. While when you have the bandwidth diversity in the neuronal selectivity profile, then all the clouds of neural responses that correspond to different stimuli, which were kind of clumped together, they end up getting spread out into the different subspaces of neural activity space, which means that these different kind of selectivity or selectivity profiles or diversity in the neuronal cells, the selectivity profiles, that ends up transforming these neural manifolds in the real in the model of the brain in different geometrical transformations, such that as a result you end up with more efficient and better separated neural manifolds. And we also find that, so we also replicate this in real neuronal recordings in monkey data as well. So this manifold theory can help us understand the role of these neuronal profiles, such as tuning curve shapes, in the efficiency of emergent neural populations. And just as a side note, people have tried to study this question with the more classical method like Fisher information and SNR analysis, but what they could do was to just measure the amount of information, but it was not possible to understand the actual changes in the structure of neural populations. So now we have this additional intermediate level mechanistic description of what's going on in the representations. And there's a lot of different things that you can do with this kind of approach. But just before finishing, let me just flash one other method, which is using this geometry as a way to build a deep network. So in visual neuroscience, it has long been assumed that sensory neurons, they evolve and develop into efficiently encoded statistical regularities in their visual environment. And this is a theory that was originally proposed by Horace Barlow. And what's known as efficient coding principle or hypothesis was a very successful endeavor in explaining the neuronal profiles in early visual processing. But extending these ideas effectively to downstream visual areas has remained challenging. And one reason is that the classical efficient coding principle for early vision or early visual area was mostly focused on preserving as much information about the external world in the neurons, including everything, while for later and higher sensory areas, you need to actually start to think about how to transform these representations and actually throw away some irrelevant information so that the downstream neuron representations become efficient for actually doing tasks rather than representing the whole world that's out there. And this is where we came in. So we know that the manifold capacity measures how packable these neural manifolds are in the representation space from the readout's perspective. And this is actually a form of task efficiency of the representation. So can't you actually train a deep network with it? And then this is exactly what we did. We trained a deep net to basically maximize this manifold capacity as an objective function. And what we found is that this can learn the state-of-the-art object classification representations, despite the fact that we didn't use any class labels. And this model also ends up learning, it can predict the neural activities from the real monkeys pretty well. So it turns out that this can serve as a good way to, this principle can give rise to how to learn good object representations without category labels, and also coming up with models of the brain. So with that, quickly just to summarize, I hope I was able to convince you that this theory of neural manifolds can formally connect the readout capacity with the underlying representation geometry with complex shapes of neural variabilities beyond the second-order statistics. And it can also capture the aspects of efficient coding principle and generalize it to downstream task implementations. And you can use this on all sorts of different data sets. And it can also help build and interpret neurally inspired deep learning models. And it can also, you can also extend this framework to many different computations and tasks beyond a simple classification problem, such as context-dependent decision-making or classification problem, or multitask generalization problem, or doing some kind of continuous estimation task, despite the fact that there's nuisance variations that you need to overcome. And with that, all of these are the papers that were highlighted in the talk, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have time for, okay, let's do 3 questions.
Sorry, I ran a little over time.
Hi, thanks for the talk. And so I want to ask so it seems the theory is based on classification problems. So if I think of say estimation problem to approximate a continuous function, how should I interpret the manifold capacity in that case?
Oh, so like how do you think about the version of this theory for continuous problem?
Say I want to use the neural network to solve an estimation problem to estimate a continuous function. So in that case, I'm not really doing classification. So I don't really need a linear separability in that case. So how do I interpret the manifold capacity in that case?
Yeah. So you're right that for continuous the problems that deal with continuous variables, often the measures that are more popular are things like accuracy, if you were solving some kind of generalization problem or some kind of reconstruction error. But the part where something like manifold capacity becomes useful is if you want to understand the efficiency of your representation. Like in order to solve the same problem with the given geometry, how many feature dimensions do you need? So to talk about that scaling, that's where this notion of manifold capacity becomes useful. Yeah.
Okay. So neural networks, or artificial neural networks, have scaling behavior in certain regimes. So in particular, also I'm thinking about low model capacity and then scaling data, and also small data, large model capacity, etc.
Right.
Is this something that you can see, and can you also predict whether or see differences in the mechanisms that are at work in these regimes?
Oh, so is your question, can we study the scaling behavior by looking at the geometry?
Yeah. And you see differences between these various regimes?
So this is actually a direction that I would love to actually expand further on, because there is a built-in scaling in this, this framework, right? Because the number of categories that are linearly classifiable per dimension, this assumes that the measure is extensive. The number of categories you can implement is extensive with the number of units that are being imposed. And what this is telling us is that the geometry actually determines the slope of that scaling. So we haven't actually done too much work going into the direction of the scaling law phenomena, but I think there's definitely something to do there, and I would be happy to talk more if anyone's interested in pursuing this. Yeah.
All right. In the interest of time, let's close here. Thank the speaker again.